Our next speaker is Colonel Carmine Cicalese. Colonel Cicalese is the current Division Chief for Cyberspace and Information Operations, Headquarters, Department of the Army. A self-described information journeyman, Colonel Cicalese commissioned into the United States Army as a signal officer and later transitioned to the Information Operations career field. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree from the United States Military Academy and Master of Science degrees from the University of Maryland, University College, and the U.S. Army War College. Here to discuss information operations in support of cyberspace operations, Colonel Carmine Cicalese.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. And just as someone who's in the information business, that's great branding. This is my given name. I probably need to come up with something else. It's a mouthful. But anyway, thanks for having me. I want to talk a little bit about a couple of my favorite topics. As the Division Chief for Information Operations in Cyberspace, I'll talk about information operations in cyberspace. And hopefully you'll find it entertaining. And being from the Pentagon, let's see if I can operate this machine. No. Super. There we go. Okay. Oh, let me try this. Oh, there we go. Doop, doop. Okay, back and forth. So I've been working on this a little over a year and had some other people that were part of it. Rob Hickman, who's a lieutenant colonel in the Army, psychological operations officer, Lieutenant Colonel Tim Martin, who's an information operations officer, and Lieutenant Colonel Brady Stout, who's the battalion commander in the 780th MI Brigade, who is a cyberspace warrior. And we all kind of put our heads together to work on this. And also there's a few slides in here that are courtesy of Mr. Mark Romanich and Mr. Rob Cordray of First IO Command fame. And so really this is a collective effort, and it's not all just mine. I just don't want to put their names on it in case they want to be able to disavow themselves of it. So here's the problem statement, and I have to be honest. I did the brief, and then I went back and wrote the problem statement. All right? But the genesis of the brief kind of comes when you look at information operations historically used to be the 5 pillars, and one of those was computer network operations. Computer network operations has become bigger, and now it's cyberspace operations. And we get into this kind of chicken and the egg discussion of which one's bigger, which one's more important, who should be in charge. And my answer is, well, it depends what you're doing. It depends who you're supporting. So we have to take a doctrinal look, and I've got a few slides here on doctrine. So the first one up is the definitions. But when you look at them, what stands out to me is that you're talking about 2 different types of concepts. IO, information operations, is an integrating function. And then cyberspace operations are domain operations. So being in the Army and we do land operations, when you do land operations, you bring everything that you can to bear in that domain, plus other domains to be effective. The same thing with cyberspace. If I'm going to do cyber operations in the cyber domain, I want to bring everything to bear. But now IO isn't, again, this integrating function to affect adversary decision-making while protecting your own. So the way I look at it is, how do I do it in that domain? But in the Army, we're focused again in the land domain, so most of our emphasis has been there. When you keep digging into doctrine and you look at the next level, you see that cyberspace is described here in the joint publication as part of the information environment. The information environment supports the other domains, consists of the physical, information, and cognitive dimensions, and at least the way this is graphically portrayed, it shows cyberspace to be part of the physical dimension. I don't fully agree with that, and we'll take a look in a moment why. But anyway, cyberspace is part of the information environment and becoming a bigger part of the information environment as it expands. Now, if I keep digging into doctrine and I start to look at the information operations doctrine and how do you influence people and what's the thoughts behind it and bring it to bear ends, ways, means, it describes the physical, informational, and cognitive dimensions. Now, those things that are in the white box is how I think cyberspace relates to the information environment. So, for example, the cyber infrastructure is part of the physical domain, physical dimension. You can put your hands on the Cat5 cable, on the fiber cable, on the computer, on the keyboard, and such. You can put your hands on the server. It's physical. But just as much as the data that moves within, for example, data at rest in a server is part of the information dimension. Very vulnerable there. You could do lots of things to affect the content of that information. And then also, as we realize, a lot of audiences use cyberspace as a medium to pass information. And through that, they're able to make cognitive decisions. But if you look at, now that's like the broad look at the information environment, but those boxes in orange are what I contend actually exist within cyberspace. So just like there's vulnerable audiences to the land component commander, for example, I'll go back to my days in Baghdad, you've got the Iraqi populace or the Baghdad populace, audiences that you're trying to influence. But there may be audiences within cyberspace that are vulnerable for influence. Cyber actors make decisions. They have a cognitive space that they have themselves that may or may not exist in cyberspace, but they make decisions on how to act in cyberspace. And likewise, you have key influencers. So just like I might go to the mayor of Baghdad, if I'm the land component commander, within cyberspace there are key influencers that move and make decisions and affect how other people act in cyberspace. So what are some of the things, though, that cyberspace can do to support information operations? Well, these are just kind of hypotheticals, but if you look at Doctrine and you understand what goes on in cyberspace, information operations is about affecting information content and flow. There's a lot of information, as we already discussed, that's available in cyberspace, and it's moving and flowing, so you can always affect the adversary's information content and flow. You know, look at any of these, for example. ISIL, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. If they're reading the newspapers, they're doing a lot of propaganda and recruiting, so potentially, and they're doing it online. So potentially, you could go in using cyberspace and affect that. Likewise, if you have a website where you're trying to, let's say the State Department, where you're trying to counter that type of terrorist message, well then you would want to be able to protect it and you want to be able to expand your information realm and push it forward. Likewise, some of the things we have to talk to our soldiers about, for example, they're posting photos of their operational experience. For example, if I post a photo of a damaged Humvee and say this was the Humvee, wow, dating myself, hello, like an MRAP or a damaged tank or striker vehicle, so they post that online and they say, here's where I was on this date, and you can extract the date timestamp from the photo and figure out where that was, when that was, and if you're the adversary, you can get a look at what your battle damage assessment is. So those are the types of things that we have to train our soldiers on and teach ourselves to protect information. But that's, again, cyberspace supporting information operations. It's all good. Keep doing it. But again, I ask the question, well, what if I'm a cyberspace commander? How do I want to do things? So the four elements of national power: diplomacy, information, military, and economic. And we're already doing some things there. For example, it starts back when President Obama wrote the op-ed talking about others exploiting our information. It gets legs, and somebody else refers to it here in Wired magazine. Then you follow up with the Mandiant report, which is exposing the Chinese for what they're doing, and then a little diplomacy action here when we start to talk about maybe we need to go to diplomacy. So these are all kinds of soft power tools, if you will, trying to get others to change their behavior. And then it culminates most recently in the indictment of the Chinese PLA members. All of these good things. Keep doing them. Don't stop. But this is all national level. And again, I've asked myself, if I'm in the military, what do I want to do? What else can we do? So as an information operations planner, what I try to do is show the commander what does the terrain look like. And if I could look down from 20,000 feet, 30,000 feet, I'd look down and describe the situation to the commander. I want to lay out the terrain. So in a cognitive sense, we've got ethnic groups that make collective decisions. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you have a group that's anti-U.S. Top right-hand corner, that group is pro-U.S. And then in between, they have the mixed groups. So those are key people I might want to influence. The lines of communication where the road is, people travel down that road. Information travels down that road as people move. And also you have a cell phone system that's mirroring or paralleling that road. Then you might also have some radio stations, non-government organizations, or internet cafes, all where people are accessing information so that they can make decisions on what to do. But it's not, I can't do everything. You only have so many resources, so you focus on what's important. And you say to the boss, here are the key elements that we want to focus on. A radio station and a non-government organization in the bottom, radio station, non-government organization in the top. Oh, by the way, there's an internet cafe that's close to the radio station, and that's where people go. So now, though, I've described the information terrain to a land component commander. But what does it mean? How would I describe it to a cyberspace commander? How would I define the terrain inside of that internet cafe? I might do this. Use the open source interconnected model. So 7 layers. I like to use it because it's fairly discrete, a little easier to use than the TCP/IP model. But I'm a cyber user, all right? I know how these things work. I got to plug it in. I've got to establish a session, make sure I've got a wireless connection, log in, go through my router and all that great stuff, maybe use PKI or SSL encryption. I use all of it. I know I'm using it only because I have some background in it, but at the end of the day, I really don't care. I just want to access the application layer. I just want to go to my websites, check my email, do my business, and be done with it. But my contention is, though, is that cyber actors, those that want to penetrate your network, which you have to secure and defend, are maneuvering at the other layers. So now I have to look at what's the key terrain in those other layers. So if you look at the threats and mitigations, again, another depiction of the OSI model, and you can see the yellow are the vulnerabilities and the white are the countermeasures. This is an approximation of where they occur inside of that terrain. So now, what do I do if I'm taking the information operations approach of how do I go about protecting this or affecting the information content and flow to the cyber actors? And then I just applied what I would call the I/O model, but really it's just operations. You can call it whatever you want, but as you look through the spectrum, how might I do this? Well, if I use the electronic warfare mentality of jamming and I've got a wireless connection, well, then I can affect the physical layer. Obviously, very close in probably need the access and proximity. Looking at the top, we already talked about the denying connectivity. What about using, I'll call it military information support operations, influence messaging? And these are just examples of where the opportunity might present itself, where I could actually go in, insert a message that would influence the cyber actor to take a course of action that's favorable to me. Operations security, that's your unclassified indicators. Do you do business inside your network in such a way that you're going to tip your hand? Do we know whether or not our adversary has any type of access or sensors in our network? If I'm always deploying my vulnerability alerts the same way, does that preempt him and give him a way to think through and say, oh, I can beat them to the punch here because they always do business the same way? What about misdirections, a feint or a ruse? Here, I want you to see this over here so that you take an action so that I could either penetrate to your flank, or I could at least occupy your time and build my defenses somewhere else. What about civil military operations, interagency, non-government organizations? How do we work with our partners to train our partners to be able to defend their networks and do these types of things? But when you look at it, this is going to be really a very intelligence-intensive event because it's very tactical. You have to be able to track the individuals and know that they can see what you're doing and that they're reacting to it. So you have to ask yourself at the end of the day, is this really worth it? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is my presentation. Hope to leave some opportunity for questions. That's it. Well, that was easy.
Thank you for your comments, remarks here. I'm curious, in your In your comparison to IO, how IO supports cyber, what do you see differently when you look at the other domains? So because I see a lot of similarities there, but is there anything you're keying on specific in your comparatives?
What I tried to key on is, who's my critical audience if I'm cyberspace and I have to defend and secure my network? That's one. So actually, you could also look at it and say that your users are critical, and you have to inform and educate them to take the best practices. Assuming all that occurs, then what's my next challenge? And my next challenge are all those that are trying to penetrate. But because they operate in different terrain, what I was really trying to get at is I have to think in how do they maneuver in that terrain. And that's where the difference is. So that's what I talked about. I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but I think that's the fundamental difference is you have to be able to define the terrain where the actor or adversary is maneuvering in order to take an approach of how do I affect their decision making so that they don't come my way. Does that answer? Sir, another one.
Yes, sir. What I wanted to add was, what did you think about, in addition to your physical domain, adding virtual? Because now we're dealing with virtual devices and, more of a cloud architecture.
I gave it a little bit of consideration, and I've seen that one before, and I have to admit, it did occur to me. I didn't include it in, because when I actually looked at virtual, I thought more of also the virtual personalities, the virtual personas that exist. Not necessarily always the same person that exists in the physical world. But I think you're still going to have to go in and figure out where is that person, and who is that person, and who is the actual. As far as the virtual networks, which I think is where your question was also aimed at, again, I think that adds a level of complexity to it, because it's transient. That's a good point. Does that help? Sir.
Sir, you snuck in a little line there that said, might be intelligence intensive.
Might be, yeah.
Yeah, it is, right? But
yeah.
So what are you thinking? Do you think that there needs to be a revolution in intelligence, that there's new information needs to be provided, or is this a quantity scale-up issue? What are you thinking about on this intel shortfall?
I think it's a new type, but we have to be able to say what it is that we're looking for and describe what it is. Otherwise, we can't help our counterparts get there. We just can't throw it on the table and say, there's my problem, figure it out for me. We have to be able to show and say, hey, here's what I'm doing. Do we have the ability to track, you're talking bits, bytes, packets moving. How can I tell whether or not this is translating into what I want it to be? So it has to be a dual relationship.
Developing the requirements is the first.
Yes, sir. Developing the requirements, in case you didn't hear. Anything else? Oh, we got a couple right here. Colonel Kraft. Sorry, I thought you were just trying to get me off the stage. So.
Hey, Carmine, how's it going? Quick question for you. It seems like I/O gives you, or gives us, a longer fuse before we go into military action. I'll say military action as in cyber attack from the offensive side. As defined in the Talon manual a couple years ago, an attack really on land, and we're trying to do that for the cyber domain now, is really four things. It's, destruction or damage of property, or injury or death of a person is an attack. Anything less than attack is really, I get into I/O, we misdirect information, we can change a message, there's a whole lot of disrupt, deny type of things we can do. In this, are you offering that I/O gives us that longer fuse before we get into military action that may be paramount to attack in your construct?
In some ways it does. And, for example, OPSEC. Any commander can employ OPSEC. And if I recognize that the way I'm doing business is making myself vulnerable because my adversary can take advantage of that, then I can take all the measures necessary to change that. Some of these other things in here, when you're talking about even a MISO message, well, that takes another authority. Misdirection, depending on how you couch it, might take another authority. So you're still running into authority challenges. Right, but that are also short of an attack. Also, I think you're going to run into, just within in our culture of the military, you have, let's just say you have a Joint Force Headquarters cyber commander, or just any of the service cyber commanders who have to secure and defend their network, and that threat vector is coming from another region. And that takes coordination with a combatant command, whether or not that coordination needs to occur, or what other coordination and what type of authorities take. So there is some opportunity there. I say some, but I think there's also an unexplored opportunity that, well, maybe we can still get the authorities to do some of these things that we might not be able to do otherwise because it's not the attack that you defined. That's a fair point. Sir?
I guess that might have answered my question. First of all, I like your picture of the OSI model because it takes the notion of cyber terrain beyond just the physical. A lot of people think of it as just switches and cables, and bringing it up to the virtual world, I think, is important. Think of cyber terrain beyond just physical devices. One of your slides showed the different components of information operations, and you talked about feints and ruses as a component. Me and some colleagues have done some thinking about deception in cyber operations, and so there's a long history of deception in U.S. military operations. If you think of World War II, the Normandy beachhead, et cetera. And I guess the question on the deception planning is, well, I guess I'd be interested in your thoughts. I mean, is it an issue of authorities and or do you even need to talk about that if you're not doing some sort of what we would call an offensive operation or an attack? So I guess your thoughts on deception in cyber operations would be interesting.
Sure, and actually they were just kind of coming together in my head as you were talking, because, and Paul's question triggered it. What constitutes deception in cyberspace? So if I'm just putting code out there, choose it, your tool, whatever your countermeasure, and I'm just employing it with the intent that this adversary or actor is going to see it and take action. But it's a tool I deploy every day. Do I need an authority to go do that? Actually, I tend to think not. It's more along the lines of, you have to be disciplined to say, well, is this going to leave the bounds of my network? And where does it go? And then you have to kind of get to the authorities. And that's even when I didn't use the word deception, because military deception, that has a whole nother connotation, has a whole nother meaning of authorities. Feint and ruse in tactical sense, you can do that all day long. I don't need permission to make the enemy think I'm going to go do something, just to make a movement left. As long as I don't commit the act, then it's not a problem. So I think there's a lot of latitude out there. Something I think is really worth looking at. And you also have to be aware that is my adversary going to try and do the same thing to me? But I think a lot of people in cyber are already thinking that way. A couple other ones. Oh, one back there. Hi, Ray.
Hello, sir. Lieutenant Colonel Ray Ciraldi, Army Asymmetric Warfare Group. Sir, this is a good topic about authorities, and also too related to authorities is approval. And because if you're going to be conducting information operations in the cyber domain, so you're going to have authorities and approvals required for IO, whether it's military information support operations or military deception. And then now you are conducting operations in the cyberspace domain. So now you may likely have to get approvals, authorities and approvals there. My question is, what thought have we given as far as agility and speed of obtaining approvals when you want to conduct an operation, information operations in the cyber domain? And I know it's an open-ended question, but this is something that I'm seeing, especially with regards to joint task forces that are conducting operations now, that one of the challenges they're facing is, can we get something approved quickly enough? And sometimes that opportunity is fleeting. You may only have a few days or less.
I think the best I can do, Ray, is acknowledge your point, because you're absolutely right. And as Admiral Rogers talks about, General Alexander used to say it. I should make the correct attribution to the correct Cybercom commander. Moving at the speed of net. Sorry, you might have used that too? Maybe? No. But, being able to move at the speed of the net and be able to take action. Again, why did I say, I put information in parentheses, says it's operations. Do I have more latitude if it's just operations? If I start to call it information operations or military deception, and it's really not quite that, do I need the permission to go do it? So in a tactical sense, for example, if you want to look at, for example, jamming the wireless connection, that's actually relatively easy to do. But if you call the same thing or the same thing equates to a cyber attack to do it, well, that's a lot harder. So again, I think it depends on how you couch the operation, how you want to define it, and then try to figure out what's the best way to go about it. But going back to your point, the best I can do is really acknowledge it. Yes, it's a challenge.
Yes, sir, and I didn't expect a specific answer to it, but I bring it up especially for the whole audience that when you try to get this done, or you realize that time becomes a significant resource that you may not have much of. If you find an operation where you have weeks and months to plan and prepare, that is an ideal situation. But sometimes you will not get that. You may only have a few days or less. So I just wanted to bring that up for thoughts for the future, and just to see if you had any insights.
No,
thanks, sir.
Thank you, Ray. So I just went back to this again. I couch it. I just use the IO model, if you will, and want to affect decision making. Again, if it's just operations, if it's the same tool that I always use, what's the issue? I don't know that there is one. So again, how you define it, it helps yourself. Yes, sir.
Hi, excuse me, Thomas Pena. Just carrying that thought a little bit farther. We talked about the approval process, and earlier today we heard about the concerns for remaining anonymous to be effective. Can you talk a little bit about where the Army is going in developing capabilities that are perhaps easier to get approved at a tactical level versus national level equities?
Not really, and the reason is I just don't have the awareness of those types of tools right now. A lot of the tools that we're building are defensive in nature, and so to support defensive cyberspace operations, cyber situational awareness, and those are things or tools that we employ and probably commercial vendors employ as well every day. So that's about the most specifics that I have available right now. I'm sorry if I can't give you more.
Sir?
Mr. Payson.
So as we're looking at this, and we talked earlier about echelons, core, and below integration, does this become essentially the staff estimate, the staff effort that a echelon, core, and below staff is looking at as they're trying to integrate this into land operations? How do I bring the cyber capabilities that are being brought to bear for land power purposes? Or is this something separate from what we're now calling the SEMA working group or SEMA element is looking at?
I would recommend it, for example, to a service cyber component, perhaps to a Joint Force Headquarters cyber, and then, when applicable, push down through the channels, probably through I want to say the G6 and J6 channels, because that's where the defense, a lot of the defense will occur, and out through that force. But I think it's more of a cyber command type model than necessarily a brigade combat team. So if I understand your question correctly, it goes back to the coordination of, here's the space where I'm operating. So I need your help here. Don't jam on it. Don't step on it. I might need your help to protect it. And then and here are my interests of what I'm trying to influence. If you see anything, please inform me. And that's reciprocal between the staffs. Yes, ma'am.
In today's world, there are a slew of public affairs organizations with a public-facing messaging presence, including social media sites for a variety of units. How do they fit into the messaging and the I/O and the confronting the adversary?
No, thank you for that. So if I went back a couple slides where I talked about diplomacy and information, any government organization or even any commercial organization that has public relations and is trying to affect adversarial behavior that's affecting their networks, whether you're a target or whomever, is to leverage that, the public affairs and public relations specialists, to get out your message. Again, you might not get a permanent effect out of it, but if nothing else, you get your adversary to think about going somewhere else for now or until you have an opportunity to shore up your defense. And then likewise, as you bring this down to the tactical level, I don't have any initial techniques, but I think that in each lower organization you could look and say, how would I use my public affairs to complement this effort? And it would be in the smaller organizations where maybe you have a little more fidelity of what's going on. That's a great question. Thank you. Sir? Hi, Joe.
Hey, Joe Hartman, 780th Commander. I just, we've addressed the support to core and below a couple of times, and a piece of that does get to the authorities. So, whether we're talking about some type of denial of service or redirection or delivery of some type of I/O content, theoretically, the bar to get that approved in a brigade commander's AOR should be much less than it should be if we're talking about at the national level. And so while these two initiatives aren't necessarily linked, certainly some of the things that are being pointed out here, I'm honestly going to take some of this back and look at the initiatives that we have working right now and the work that we've done with the SEMA cells at the division and brigade level, and certainly there is some linkage there. But the CSCP pilot that we're doing in support of Chief Staff of the Army, that will, the first real iteration of that will be with 3rd Brigade, 25th ID at JRTC in May of this year. Hasn't necessarily been linked to this effort right there, but I certainly think that there's value in us kind of getting together and leveraging the work that Carm's done here.
Hey, sir.
Hi, Rob.
Wow, this is louder. One of the questions I'd have for you and for the audience is, you were there whenever we were trying to roll out this new idea called I/O and get it integrated into the operational and tactical picture. What lessons learned would you apply or you would share for an emerging cyber community that is likewise trying to start and grow and is now about to start tackling? How do you effectively integrate with a commander who his understanding of cyber is if it's either working or it's not, and he's used to just trying to wish it away, quite frankly, because what he really cares about is physical terrain?
Well, you have to make the commander care. But how do you do that? And that is to learn to put it into terms that the commander can understand, which goes back to one of the, this slide, courtesy of you and Mark, but this was a language that the commander could speak. And so you put this as an information operations overlay in front of the commander. Commander said, I get this. I understand this. I can look at the terrain. I can see the information on the terrain. So then there's the same challenge. Jump forward to that. Ooh, if I put that in front of the commander, I can put it in front of this crowd, and most people understand what I'm talking about. But I would need to find, I think, another model to use and be able to speak to this to the commander and say, this is what the adversary is doing, this is what our users are doing, and this is where they're making themselves vulnerable, this is how we're trying to protect ourselves. Define the terrain for the commander, okay, I got it. Then flipping this and saying, and this is how we can affect the adversary's terrain so that he can't do capability A or B. And be very passionate and concise. The last one is the big challenge. Hope that helps.
Sir, Major Drew Bird, our cyber. It kind of links to that question, but then how, going forward, a slide there, how would you kind of make the key terrain determination and then kind of get into the OCO type stuff to actually apply it kind of more to the doctrine type?
See, I think I could put this in front of the Army Cyber Commander and he'd get it. Huh? Yeah, he'd get it. So again, if I'm talking to a Cyber Commander, they'll understand this. You might, there are better pictures out there. You know, I just found the one that I liked to be able to use because it had all the words big enough, so it wasn't real fine print, so people can look back and say, if you didn't, just in case you didn't know what the network layer did, well, then you can look at that and have an idea of that. Okay, IP address, I've heard of that. But again, I think if you speak cyber to a cyber commander, that they'll get this. Did I answer your question? I think I only answered it halfway, though. What was that? Can you say it again, please? Okay. Right. Well, I think that's based on your threat and your vulnerabilities and what is most critical for you to protect. So there's two parts to that question. One is the system approach. I have to be able to protect this system because I need to be able to execute this mission command function no matter what. That's a way of defining key terrain. And then you're defining the system. Then you might want to, after you look at the system, then you might want to look and break down, how does this apply? Where is the vulnerabilities, or where are the key vulnerabilities? Because being able to defend everywhere across every layer for every system doesn't maybe make as much sense as a systemic approach. So then, you know, using what you just said, well, then maybe I go around and flip this model some other way. That's helpful. Thank you. Another one back there. Do I have time? Yes, sir.
Combat team, and I was the effects coordinator. And I can tell you down at the BCT level, the commander's time is very limited. He's got a huge staff now. So my question is, are we looking at how target value analysis is done in the information domain during IPB, during the MDMP process? And then if so, defining our capabilities and limitations, whether it's information operations, cyber, EW, and then being able to explain what our capabilities and limitations are to the brigade commanders, and then give him the so what and let him make the decision on that. And then as we're in actual execution of operations, if we incorporate IO, cyber, EW into the normal targeting cycle, I think we'll bring it into terms that a maneuver commander can understand and start to get a grasp of in order to leverage our capabilities.
So I would ask you, did you ever see anything like this?
From the IO perspective?
Yeah. From the tooth perspective, from anybody in the staff?
Absolutely. We saw key terrain diagrams like that. And if I throw that up in front of the commander, he's kind of going to look at it from a kinetic sense of, okay, this is my key terrain and what I got to physically do to it to influence it. As an artilleryman, I can provide you with the kinetic effects, but I always tried to talk to the commander about what type of electronic warfare effects we could provide, and or given the situation, what type of information operations effects we could provide down there as well. And then how we can measure those effects. Because it gets tougher when you start getting into cyber and electronic warfare domain. It gets a little bit tougher, you know, a lot more subjective on our assessments that we're making.
I'll give you this food for thought. And once upon a time, sir, I don't know if you remember this, but Colonel Hernandez called me into his office on the Joint Staff, and he said, you know, so you're a real IO guy. Yes, sir. He said, where should the home of Army IO be? I said, Fort Sill. Because I equate it to fires coordination. Go fast forward now, my previous boss was Major General Vandal, who was an artilleryman who used to tell me, I started off as an artilleryman and now I'm a fire support officer. I bring in fires, I coordinate fires. So I always liked the fire support model of describing this. So if I take the things that the commander can speak to, key terrain, here's your information. I'm able to give them a picture of the information key terrain. And then, if these are the key sites, what are the capabilities that I can use, coordinated fire support, to achieve the effect I want? And that goes back to speaking the commander's language. I don't know, again, if I answered your question, but that's the way I like to present it, as fire support coordination.
Yes, sir. And as an effects coordinator, I always found I was taking the IO officer and the electronic warfare chief and getting them over in with the S2 and fusing them together during target value analysis in order to do just that, so that when we went over IPB with the commander, they could stand up and say, yeah, this is what the enemy's capabilities are across their domains, and this is the effects that we can provide for you. And it was always very short, not verbose, like, this is what we can do for you. And it allowed us to get EW incorporated a lot more, and our IO messaging incorporated a lot more into the fight. And we got to do some stuff out at NTC when we were there this past spring that was pretty successful. But I noticed a trend that, you know, in other brigades that may not necessarily be the case. So just making sure that our people out there understand, hey, listen, we've got to target in these environments, and we've got to understand how to, the people that we send down there, and we got to know the maneuver commanders, how he speaks and what he understands. So that kind of struck a chord with me.
Yeah, you know, when I left Baghdad in 2007, which was, you know, I would say was my last deployment and a seminal deployment at 14 months, I worked for the effects coordinator, who was an artillery fire support officer. And, you know, I walked out of there saying, if I had to best describe my job, I was the deputy effects coordinator for non-lethal. And that was probably the best way to describe it and look at it. Anything else? No, thanks for the great questions. That was better questions of my discussion.
Sir, thank you for your insights on information operations in support of cyberspace operations. I'd like to present to you, on behalf of ACI and Army Cyber Command, our black badge.
Super. Thank you very much.
So at this time, we'll take a quick break. Just a reminder, we'll return at 1500, but just a reminder, we're collecting the surveys outside at the registration desk, so if you've completed those, please drop those off for us. Thank you.